All right, Shabbos say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Should to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shurma and Drashos this month. And this is supposed for a Fuah Shalema for Kathy's sister, Dana Baker Matheson. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Choli, so will have a complete and enduring refuah. But with that, let us begin with a very exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Tes, page 9. We are picking up on Chesed base 8b, a little bit up at the two dots. It is Ibayilahu. We actually read this already yesterday, but let's begin it today. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. 14 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows: Ibayilahu. Here is the shaila. So remember again, at the end of yesterday's daf, we were introduced to the idea that halacha l'maisa, there's something called the get shichur, which is a document of emancipation. And what the Gemara is already leading us to believe is that a get shichur, a document of emancipation, follows many of the same procedures as a get isha, as a woman's get as well. Specifically, again, it sounds like you're going to have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam if that get is written in Medinas Hayam. So the Gemara says as follows: Tan Rabbanon, Evet shehivi gito, ibaylehu, kol nechasai kinuyim lecha. So I'll say, what happens if a master goes ahead and writes in the get shechra, all of my property is acquired by you? So essentially, the master is conveying over all of his property to the Eved. So the Gemara Abaye says, "Mitoch shekana atzmo kana nechasin." And remember again, we're talking about over here an Eved Kanani, right? It's a non-Jewish servant. A non-Jewish servant is considered to be property. So now Abaye says, well, when the master effectively gives over all of his property to the servant, included in all of my property is what? Is the Eved himself. So essentially what the master is doing is he's giving over the Eved, as a piece of property over to the Eved, including all of their property. So therefore, by definition, the Eved goes free. And by dint of the fact that he acquires himself, he acquires all of his property as well. So Rava says, 1 second, let's analyze this. Bishlama atzmo likni. So I understand why the Eved should be able to acquire himself. Why? Midi dahava aget. Because ultimately, again, this is no different than get. No different than get. Now, say, what does it mean it's no different than get? If you look at Rashi says over here, look at atzmo kana, the ne'emanhu. Midi dahavi get isha. It's in the wide lines of Rashi, 3 lines in. Midi dahavi get isha. Shne emenes lahavi eskida. V'lomar b'fanei nechtav. So the same way that a woman is believed ultimately again to bring her get on her own from chutz la'aretz, and ultimately again to say b'fanei nechtav. I just want to pull up the Rambam, and to say b'fanei nechtav, so too the Eved is believed ultimately to go ahead and bring his own get, and thereby affect his own emancipation. However, but ultimately, again, Rava says he should not be able to acquire the property. Why? Because we'll say that should be no different than regular kiyim shtaros. And I will say, in other words, that any time you're trying to go ahead and affect a transfer of property, that's going to require a shtar. A shtar, in order to be valid, it requires kiyim shtaros. One person is not effective to go ahead and create kiyum shtaros. So an interesting machlokes Abaye and Rava. So remember again, let's frame the case. Master writes, kol nechasim kinuyim lecha. All of my property is acquired to you. Well, Abaye says, since he acquired himself, he acquired all the property as well. Rava says, no, he acquires himself in the same way that a woman could bring her own get, but he does not acquire the property because the property would require kiyum shtaros, which is a process which requires independent corroboration by 2 witnesses. So Hadar Amr Abaye, so Abaye then retracted. And Abaye said, you're right. Mitoch shelo kana nechasim lo kana atzmo. So Abaye then says, Abaye's whole approach is, it has to be absolute. In other words, if this document works for one thing, it should work for the other as well. So therefore, Abaye says, halacha l'maisa, if he did not acquire the property, he does not acquire himself. Amalei Rava. So Rava says, no. Bishlam nechasim lo likni midi dehavi akiyim shtaros. So Rava says, no, you're missing the point. He wouldn't acquire the property. Why? Because the property acquisition is a function ultimately again of kiyum shtaras. But he should be able to go ahead and acquire himself. Why? Because ultimately, again, it's no different than get isha, right? It's no different than the case of get, where a woman is believed to bring her own get to Ela Amarava. So therefore, we'll say again, third iteration of this, Rava says, Echad azeh v'echad zeh. Now we'll say echad zeh v'echad zeh means in both of these cases. Now remember again, we have two cases. Now look at Rashi. Look at Rashi. 4 lines into the wide lines. Echad zeh v'echad zeh. Bein atzmecha unachasai. Bein kol nechasai. But remember again, in case number 1, which was the last case we read yesterday, the master writes to the servant, atzmecha unachasai. Both yourself and my property are acquired to you. Case number 2 that we're dealing with over here is kol nechasai. All of my property should be acquired to you. So Rava says in both of these cases, echad zeh v'echad zeh, atzmo kana nechasim lo kana. The Eved acquires himself, he does not acquire property. Right? He acquires himself, but he does not acquire property. Okay? So that's Rava's position. Only Rava Rava Kimman. So we'll say, so Rava says, that's Rava, whose opinion are you echoing? To which the Gemara says, Reb Shimon. What does Reb Shimon say? The Amar Palginan Dibura. Palginan Dibura. Let's say, what does Palginan Dibura mean? Literally, we split his words. We splice his words. Palginan Dibura. So the Gemara says, Disnan hakosef kol nechasav li'avdo. If a person writes all of his property to his servant, Yatsa ben Chorin. Ultimately, again, he goes out to be a ben Chorin. He's a free man. Shir karka kolshu. If, however, halacha l'maaseh goes ahead and retains some amount of karka for himself, lo Yatsa ben Chorin. Shabbos says this is an interesting point over here, right? So a master frees his servant. So if he frees his servant in totality, right? If he writes all of his property to his servant, the servant goes free. Okay? If, however, halacha l'maaseh, the master retains a piece of property for himself. For example, Shilki Rashi, Shir Karka Koshulo Yatsa Chorin, Karka Lav Dafki Kidar Babasra. So let's say the master says, I hereby go ahead and give you all of my property, right? That's the lashon over here, right? I hereby give you all my property, except for this field. So the Gemara says, Lo Yatsa ben Chorin. In that case, the servant does not go out as a ben Chorin. Now we'll say, now why not? Why is it that if the master retains a particular field, that Allah Chalamayse doesn't go out as a ben Chorin? Look at Rashi. Last Rashi in the daf. Lo Yatsa ben Chorin. The Bishlam Aresha, the Gali Daite, the Nachas the Shir, the Armin the Shir, the Hacha, the Nachas the Shir, Armin the Didei Namishir. So we'll say, here's the concern. And obviously, this is part of a much bigger conversation, but Lamaisi, here's the concern. Once the master is withholding property for himself, the concern is maybe his das is also to withhold ownership over the servant. Since an Eved Kenani is effectively like Karka, once he's going ahead and retaining karka for himself, the concern is that maybe he's not really emancipating the Eved. Okay, so that's the concern over here. Rabbi Shimon says, top of test, no. The Olam Hu ben Chorin, not true. Even when the master goes ahead and says to the Eved, I hereby give you all of my property except for a field, Rabbi Shimon says, how do we look at that statement? Palginan Dibure. We go ahead and we split up the statement. Essentially, the statement number 1, which is, you're free, which is effectively what you say, what you mean when you say, all of my property is yours, you're free, right? And then ultimately, again, the field, the ownership, the owner retains, the master retains ownership over that. The only time you get into a problem, according to Rabbi Shimon, is when he says, Achiomar kol nechasai nisun leploni avdi chutz merivo shebahen. So I'll say this is interesting. The only time Rabbi Shimon says that Allah might get into a problem is when the owner goes ahead, when the master goes ahead and says to the Eved, all of my property belongs to you, except for a percentage, 1/10,000th, something like that. So I'll say that's an expression. The idea over here is when the master doesn't identify what he is retaining, then the concern is that what is he retaining, or what is he possibly retaining? The Eved himself. in which case that'll undermine the entire emancipatory process. Now, I will say, the point over here is Rabbi Shimon is the opinion. So I'll say, so let's take a step back. So Rava, at the end of the day, we have multiple cases, right? So Rava says, the bottom line with all of these cases is the Eved will acquire himself, he won't acquire the property. That's true whether the master says, all of my property belongs to you, right? That's true whether the master says, or the master says, you and all of the property belong to you, right? Whatever it is, Rava will say, the slave acquires himself, he does not acquire the property. Does not acquire the property. What's the logic? Pagina dibure. We split up the words. Essentially, when the master is talking about, when the master is giving over everything to the servant, we effectively splice that statement and we say he's making two statements. Statement number one is you're free. You're free. Statement number two is I'm giving you all my property. So essentially what we do is we pick up on statement number one because an Eved is able to affect that by bringing the get on his own. Statement number two is a more complicated process of property transfer, so we're going to have to leave that on the side. But the ability to take one statement and divide it into two is a function of Rabbi Shimon, Paginan Dibure. I will say, thinking about this idea that Paginan Dibure is sometimes one of the most effective and important pieces to building happy and functional relationships. Inevitably, in every single relationship, right, people say things that hurt. Right? Think about this, right? In the context of a marriage, in the context of parents and children, right? So I say, let's focus from our perspective. I say, or let's focus, my perspective. I say something that hurts someone else. I will say, what happens when someone tells you something that hurts you? What happens? Often that statement, right, overshadows the entire relationship. It's so interesting. You could have years and years of a good track record in a relationship, and whatever, you could plug in any relationship you want. And what happens? Someone says to you one negative thing, and that statement often in your mind defines the totality of the relationship. I can't believe you said that. It could apply actionally as well, but Lamais will focus over here on words. So what does Rabbi Shimon teach us? Rabbi Shimon teaches us the art of Palginan Dibure. And what's the art of Palginan Dibure? You have to know how to split words. This was said, but let's split that off from everything else and not use it to characterize a relationship in its totality. Palginan Dibure, that was said, it was wrong, it was hurtful, but let's divide. Let's divide. There is what is the marriage, there is what is the relationship, and there was what was just said now. But what was just said now need not characterize the totality of the relationship. It's not just true by words, as I mentioned before, it's true by actions as well, right? Someone who I love hurts me very badly. Often that one action, that one moment of hurt, somehow eclipses everything else in the relationship. The ability to divide and the ability to contextualize and the ability to take one moment, one episode, one word of hurt and put that into context and not allow it to overshadow the entire relationship, I think is the secret to successful, well, it's not a secret, it's in the Gemara, secret to successful relationship. Rabbi Shimon is not just giving us good Eitzah by Yavid Kanani, he's giving us good Eitzah by life. Learn the art of Palginan Dibure and ultimately affect meaningful relationships. Incredible Yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. So Rabbi Yosef Bar Menyumi said, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Rabbi Yosef Bar Menyumi, Amar Rav Nachman, Afal Pi Shekilis Rabbi Yossi Es Rabbi Shimon. Even though Rabbi Yossi praised Rabbi Shimon, halacha Rabbi Meir. The halacha, in fact, does not follow Rabbi Shimon, but rather the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. Now, what I want to point out is Rabbi Meir is the Tanakama over here. Rashi says, "The lo yatsa l'cheirus." In other words, we'll say back in that brayso, "Hakosev kol nechas of the avdo yatsa ben chorin shir karka kol shehu lo yatsa." In other words, we'll say Rabbi Meir is the opinion that says that if a master says to his eved, right, all of my property is acquired by you, right, except for this field, for a field, right? So Lamaisa, Rabbi Meir, who's the Tanakama, the unnamed Tanakama over here, says the eved doesn't go free. The eved doesn't go free. Why? What are we concerned about? We're concerned that in the same way that the master retained ownership over a field, that he also retained ownership over the eved. So as nice as we're saying Rabbi Shimon's position is, Lamaisa, the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, by the way, so Rabbi Shimon's entire premise is based on what? Palginan dibure. We were using Rabbi Shimon as the support for the position of Rava. So what's going on over here? Tisanya, kishenemru dvar mifnei Rabbi Yossi. When these matters were said over in front of Rabbi Yossi, so beautiful. Kara alav hamikra azeh. He said about Rabbi Shimon this pasuk, Svasayim yishak meshiv devar nechochim. Literally again, in machlokes how to interpret this pasuk, but ultimately again the way Rashi understands it is Rashi tells us a little machlokes over here, but Rashi says the lips should kiss someone who delivers such beautiful words. So Tosfos will say, Tosfos says, just take a quick look. So we'll first look at Rashi. Let's see it inside. Rashi says, Svasayim yishak roi hu l'nashek. It is kedai to kiss such a person like this, right? It is kedai to kiss such a person who delivers such beautiful words of Torah. Tosfos says, "Svasayim yishak dvar meishiv dvar nechochim, kisha adam omer dvar nechochim osam shesviv osav mashikin sifsoseim zulazu sheshoskin v'lo yodim ala hashiv." Tosfos says that when you're in the presence of someone who says something so beautiful, what happens? See what I said? When you're first reading Tosfos, you think that what he's saying is like this. If you look at his words, Kisha Adam Omer Dvar Nechochim, when a person says true words, Osam Shesivosav, Mashikin Sifsoseim Zuluzu, they kiss their lips to one another. Sheshoskin Ve'inyodmash, they're quiet. I say, when you're in the presence of wisdom and someone says something so profound, often again, what's your reaction? What's your reaction? Silence. Silence. That's, so to speak, that's called the kissing of the lips. In other words, your lips are kissing each other. Meaning what? My upper lip is kissing my lower lip, i.e., my mouth is closed. My mouth is closed. Which I will say, by the way, is such an incredible metaphor, right? Sometimes the most beautiful kiss is silence. Sometimes the most beautiful kiss is silence. The most beautiful kiss is the kiss you give yourself when you allow the upper lip to kiss the lower lip and one remains in a complete silence. Pretty profound idea Tosfos is spouting. Either way, the point over here is, so there's a machlokes what the kiss is. According to Rashi, ultimately again, according to Rashi, Rabbi Yossi wanted to go ahead and kiss Rabbi Shimon. According to Tosfos, when people heard this beautiful exposition, they were silent. Their lips were kissing each other. Beautiful. Did Rav Nachman actually say this? So we're going to get into actually a lot of these cases. A shchiv mira is someone who's on his deathbed. So we're going to see the following case. A shchiv mira, a person on his deathbed, who wrote over all of his property to his eved. Gave over all his right to his eved. Va'amad, and then Baruch Hashem, he recovered. Now, probably not Baruch Hashem for the Eved, right? But he recovered. Now, I will say, we're going to see Shchiv Meirah is a fascinating idea for two reasons. Number one, there's a concept in general in halacha, if you want to convey ownership of something to someone, you have to use a formal kinyan. Right? You have to use some type of kinyan, some type of mode of acquisition. The halacha is by Shchiv Meirah that the words of a Shchiv Meirah affect a transaction. It's a special legislation that Chazal made for a person on his deathbed to give him just a level of inner quietude, that he should know that from his deathbed he could affect whatever he needs to affect without the normal forms of kinyan. So therefore the Gemara says as follows. So now the other piece about a Shchiv Meirah is if he gets better, all of his gifts are reversed. Right? What's the logic behind that? Because it's clear from the context that why is he giving the gift? Right? Why is he giving the gift? Because he's dying. If it turns out that Baruch Hashem is not dying, all of the gifts are reversed. So watch this. So Shchiv Meirah shekasav kol nechasav liavdo. A Shchiv Meirah who gave over all of his property to his eved. Va'amad. And Baruch Hashem, now he's healed. Right? Cholja b'nechasim. Ultimately, again, he's able to go ahead and retract all of the gifts. I will say, to be clear, he doesn't have to retract. In other words, he doesn't actually have to do anything. Just by definition, the act of healing, although it'd be funny, right? Can you imagine you're the recipient of one of those gifts? You say to Shchiv Meirah, you still look terrible, right? I just want to tell you, right? I don't think you're out of the woods yet. I just want to be clear, right? Things don't look good. Don't get ahead of yourself, right? So if he gets better, however we're defining getting better, so the mice again, all of the gifts are reversed. The Eino Choser Be'eved. I will say, interestingly enough, the one thing that he can't reverse is the emancipation of his servant. Isn't that fascinating? The emancipation of his servant. So we'll say, so why is that? Chozeh ben Chasim, ultimately, again, he goes ahead and he retracts the gifts. Why? Matna shchimirahu. Ultimately, again, because we'll say that is a matna shchimira. In other words, that's the whole chap of it. In other words, it's clearly a gift that's given. We'll say essentially, it's a gift that's given with a t'nai. What's the t'nai? What's the t'nai? That he's going to die, right? He didn't die. He didn't die. Therefore, there's no gift. So the Gemara says, "Ve'enu chozer be'eved," but he does not retract on the eved. Why? Shariyatz alav shem ben chorin. This is actually very interesting. Ultimately, again, because the eved himself, a shem ben chorin, the eved has the identity of a ben chorin. In other words, he's already been emancipated. Once he's already, or I should say, even though he has not formally been emancipated, the name of emancipation, the name of a free man, has devolved upon him. And ultimately, again, you can't go ahead and retract that. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Shariat alav shem cherus v'asher leishtabed bo. The Bible says once he has the identity of a free man, it is usher to go ahead and enslave him. Now, both say, but what do you see from this? Pagina dibure. You see from this that you're splitting the statement, because the Bible say here, remember again, the Shchimera did all of this in a gift, let's say, right? He did all of this in a gift. So Lamaisa, again, what did he do? He said to his Eved Kanani, everything is yours. Everything is yours. All of my property is yours. So let's say, and including that, of course, is the emancipation. Saloch Lamaisa, now the Gemara says he gets better. He gets better. What happens? He could retract all of the gifts, but the emancipation of the Eved still remains in place. So you see that we do split a person's word, pagin and dibure. So Alam Ravashi, Hasam Hainu Taima Mishum Delav Kros Gitahu. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. Ravashi says you're right. Ravashi says you're right. At the end of the day, halacha lamaisa, the reason why Rav Nachman said that the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. Now, say again, what case are we referring to over here? This was a case of a person who writes. This is the last case on Chesam Beis. Hakosef kol nechasav liavdo. If a person writes all of his property to his eved, and what happens? Shir karka kolshu. He withholds any amount of land. Rav Nachman said the halacha follows Rabbi Meir, the Tanakama, that the Eved does not go free in that case. Why not? So Rabbi say the reason why he doesn't go free is because it's not a real document of emancipation. Why? Rabbi say we are going to see that one of the unique similarities between the get of a woman and the get, so to speak, of an Eved Kanani is that both must affect a complete break with the husband and the master. Right? And if there is anything that tethers the woman to the husband, or ultimately, again, the servant to the master, it renders the document ineffective. The reason for that is the Torah calls a get ish, a woman's document, a sefer krisos. We're going to see the way we interpret that phrase is davar hakores beino lebeino, something that fundamentally and wholly severs the relationship between husband and wife. And we're going to take that same similarity and ultimately, again, apply it to a get shichrur. And therefore, a get shichrur must absolutely and unequivocally sever the relationship between master and servant. And so if there is anything that still links them, the get is invalid. Rabbi Meir holds that when the master is withholding property, the problem is we're not sure, the fact that he's withholding something, and an Eved himself is considered property, that is considered to be a lack of krisos in the get shikhr, and therefore renders it ineffective. Good. So we'll say, that's the end of the sugya there. I'll just tell you, I meant to print it, but I'll just tell you, the Rambam Paskins, this is in Hilchos Avadim, Perek Zayin Halacha Beis. Evet shehevi get, the cost of bo, so an Evet who brings his get, and it says in the get, Atzmecha unechasai kinuyin lecha. So for example, and it says in the get, right, you and my property are acquired by you. So the master writes to his servant, right, Atzmecha, yourself and all of my property is acquired by you. Atzmo kana v'hareyu ben chorin, he acquires himself because he is a ben chorin. Aval nechasai lo kana achis kayim haget bechosamav. So I'll say, so the Rambam Paskins like Rabbi Shimon. Palginan Diburei, we split up the statement. We essentially see that as effective for the Eved going ahead and acquiring himself, but it does not allow him to acquire the property. In order for, now, again, can he acquire the property? Can he? He can. How does he acquire the property? If two independent witnesses come along and corroborate the get shikhr. then he could acquire the property. But if it's just the Eved showing up himself and bringing the get shikrar, even though in that same get it says you are acquired by yourself, my property is acquired by yourself, or if the master writes, all of my property is acquired to you, all of these things allow the Eved to acquire himself, but ultimately, again, not the property, because it's two different mechanisms. For the acquisition of the self, it's enough for the Eved to produce his own get shikrar. For the acquisition of property, that's going to require a process of kiyum shtaros, which ultimately requires two different witnesses. And the Rambam writes, he says, an Eved is believed to bring his own get shikrar. So we'll say, good, that's the halacha. They will say, now, the Rambam does right, we also pass like Rabbi Meir, namely, the halacha l'maisa, if the Adon writes, all of my property is acquired to you, chutz mimakam plani, from a particular field, ultimately, again, the Eved does not go free. The Eved does not go free. Why? The Rambam writes, ein ze kores v'haget batal. Ultimately, again, because that's not a safer krisos. So we'll say, so we paskin like Rabbi Shimon, palgina dibure. Therefore, any situation where the master goes ahead and writes to the Eved, I hereby give you yourself and my property, the Eved goes free, he acquires himself, but the property requires a separate type of mechanism of kiyum shtaros. If the Adon retains a piece of property, that totally invalidates the get. Now, the chiddush is, by the way, even though what? Even though the Adon says, I am retaining field A, he identifies which field he is retaining. So there's no chashash that maybe he refers to the Eved, still the get shekar is going to be invalid. Because once he's retaining something, that he's retaining property, and the Eved himself is a piece of property, we're concerned about what else he may be potentially retaining, and therefore the get itself is invalid. That's the psak of the Rambam. Good. Well, it says, go back to Mishlav, Ori is kaim b'chosamav. So remember again, the Mishnah said that if halacha l'maisa, let's say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam was not done. Let's say it was not done. So let's say if it was not done, and then ultimately, again, someone objects to the authenticity of the get, there's ir. So therefore, what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa is kaim b'chosamav, will validate the get through the signatures on the document, to which the Gemara says, ir kama. When we say somebody is objecting to the authenticity of the get, how many people are objecting? If you want to say it's one witness who's objecting, that can't be. We'll say one guy can't roll in and object to the authenticity of the get. I mean, he can, but that's going to be ineffective. When we speak about ir, someone objecting to the authenticity of the get, the pashtos, what is that referring to? Two or more. So the Gemara says, ir trey. Trey or trey ninu. My chazis the samches ahani samachahani. If that's the case, Rabbi, then you have 2 against 2, right? You have 2 witnesses who signed on the get, 2 witnesses objecting to the get. I don't understand why do we believe the signators, right, over the people objecting? It's 2 against 2. Normally they cancel each other out. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Ella ir debal. No. Whenever we talk about ir, whenever we speak about somebody going ahead and objecting to the authenticity of the get, who are we normally referring to? To the Baal, to the husband. And therefore, what the Mishnah is saying is like this. In the event that B'fanei nechtav or B'fanei nechtam was not said, and the husband comes along and questions or objects to the authenticity of the get, what do? Yiskayim b'chosamav. In that case, it's a regular kiyum shtaros case, and you uphold the authenticity of the get ultimately by certifying the signatures of the witnesses. Incredible. God says, Kavayta Mishnah, Hamevi gem dinas hayam, person brings a get from overseas, and he's unable to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. We'll have to see what unable means. So what's the halacha? Im yeshalav edim yiskayim b'chosamav. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do? No different than any other case of kiyum shtaros. So we certify the get through the witnesses. Yiskayim b'chosamav. To which the Gemara says, fine. So echad Gittin nashim ve'echad shechrei avadim. So we'll say both. So we'll say both Gittin. What we'll call a get, right? Which is Gittin nashim, the get of a woman, and shechrei avadim. So we'll say. So remember again, the document of emancipation of an Eved Kanani is also called a get. It's called a get shikrar, a document of emancipation. So both the get of a woman and the get of an Eved, shavu lemolech ulemevi. They will say they are similar in that they both have the same halachas, for molech umevi. And I will say, what does it mean, molech umevi? B'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. Name the same halacha that if you bring, just like if you bring the get of a woman, right, a get isha, from overseas to Eretz Yisrael, you have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. So too for the get shichur, for a document of emancipation of an Eved Kanani, if you bring it from overseas, you also have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. Zu achas min adracham sheshavu Gittin ashel mishchir avadim. And this is one of the ways in which Gittin of a woman are similar to Gittin of avadim. Incredible. So we'll say, let's analyze the case. So we'll say, is actually a mirror image of the Gemara we had before. Mishnah begins by saying, someone is unable to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. What's the case of unable? It says, so maybe the guy's a cheresh, a deaf mute. So unable literally means unable. So cheresh bar isui gitu, is a cheresh allowed to bring a get? Vatnan, we learned, hakol ksher lahavi es get. Everyone is kosher to bring a get. Chutz mecheresh shota v'katan. With the exception of, we'll say, of a cheresh, shota, and katan, right? Because they lack mental capacity. So it can't be a cheresh, because a cheresh is not allowed to be a shaliach. Rav Yosef Hacham asking on what's the case? We'll say the case is where the Eved was a totally normal, healthy guy. And in fact, he even gave her the get when he was a pikeach, a normal, healthy individual. And I will say literally, almost like instantaneously, between the time of the giving of the get, right before he was about to say what happened? He became a cheresh. So in other words, he was an effective shaliach to deliver the get, but then ultimately again was precluded from doing so because of his newfound state of becoming a cheresh. So we'll say that's the case in the Mishnah. So so remember again, the Mishnah points out that one of the similarities between get isha and get shichrur is that you have to do b'fanechta v'fanechtam. So the Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, b'shlosha drachim shavu Gittin ashel shichrur avadim. There are three ways in which the get of a woman is similar to the get of an eved. Right? Number one, shavu l'molech l'baby, b'fanechta v'fanechtam, must be done for both of them. V'chol get sheyish alav eid kusi pasal chutz migitei Hashem v'shchir avadim. So we're going to talk about all these things because they're quite fascinating. In general, again, I will say, if you have a kusi, remember again, kusim are everywhere, right? They're in every single masach, right? Kusim, mamish, good. So I'll say, so remember again, who are the kusim? Kusim were people from Kusa, who were resettled in Eretz Yisrael by Shalmaneser, the king of Ashur, when he was going on mixing up all of the conquered nations so no one would rebel. They converted. Or I should say there was an outbreak of lions because of their idolatrous worship. They converted. Let's say, so again, we always see there's a shaila about the nature of their conversion. Was it a legitimate conversion or not a legitimate conversion? One thing is clear. The Kusim definitely keep certain things, and whatever they keep, they are very meticulous about. And there are other things which they were not keeping. So the shaila, you're like, yeah, it sounds like me, right? I just want to say, so the Maisa, right, we're all kusim, right? So ultimately, again, so the Gemara says over here. So in general, there's a shaila about how to go ahead and deal with the kusim. So in general, what's the halacha? In general, the halacha is v'chol get sheyish alav eid kusi pasal. So in general, the halacha is any get that has on an eid kusi is going to be pasal chutz migitei Hashem v'shchir avadim, except for, interestingly enough, for a get isha and a get shikhr. And I will say, we'll see why. Now, the fact that an eid kusi is normally invalid makes a lot of sense because, right, his status is questionable. Ultimately, again, why a get kusi is fit? Why an eid kusi is fit for a get isha and get shikhr? We'll see. But that's one of the similarities. Next. V'chol hashtaros, we'll say on the base. V'chol hashtaros ha'olim ba'arko shel ovdei kochavim. In general, any documents processed by a Gentile court, even though what? Even though their signatures are ovdei kochavim, are ksherim. It's interesting, right? So normally any documents processed by a non-Jewish court, even though they are signed by non-Jewish witnesses, are kosher. What's the case over here? Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, ha'olim ba'arkos sha'ovdei kochavim, shenasu hashtaras ayidei bezdin sha'ovdei kochavim. Documents which were processed by a non-Jewish court. Shechosmei, and Rashi says, shachzum b'socho ksherin the dina de malchusa dina. So we'll say again, we're going to talk about all these cases in depth, but this is fascinating. So we'll say, I just want to point out in general, just so the person should be aware, there is an Isser Arkos. The Isser Arkos says if you have a legal matter with another Jew, you are not allowed to take that to secular court without first going to Beis Din. Now, sometimes, again, Jews will go to Beis Din. Beis Din can't resolve the situation for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because one party will not show up to Beis Din, or sometimes it's just a matter that requires enforcement of a secular court. So then ultimately, there's what's called the heter arkos. There is a heter. Right? Beis Din gives permission to go to secular court. But remember, again, generally we have the concept of the Eila Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. These are the halachos that you will place before them. Rashi HaKadosh says, Lifnehem, v'lo lifnei arkos. We bring our legal matters ultimately before a Beis Din and not before a secular court. So we'll say now, that's why this halacha is quite startling. So the Gemara says over here that if you have documents, right, shtaros. Now, as I said, I just want to point out, what this is talking about over here is not necessarily a legal proceeding. What this is talking about is I went to court to have a document signed, to have a document made up, right? I'm selling land to Ruvain. I'm selling land to Ruvain. I need a document. So where did I go? I went to court. So I went to a Gentile court. Again, I'm not adjudicating anything. I'm just drafting a document. So we'll say, so if the document was drafted, even if it was signed, it was written and signed by non-Jews, ultimately, again, it's kosher. It's kosher. Now, Rashi says why? The dina demachusa dina. Because it could be that there are cases where I don't need adjudication. What I just need is a legal mechanism. And ultimately, again, if the laws of the land are the laws of the land, right? And therefore, again, if a document that is in accordance with laws of the land is written up by our codes, that's what. So it's an interesting distinction between litigation or adjudication. I don't know what the right word is, litigation or adjudication. Okay, either way, adjudication versus document drafting. So ultimately, again, so documents, the Gemara seems to say, you go to Arkos, even non-Jewish signatories, that is going to be effective. What's the exception to this? Chutz, Gittin, I both say the exception to this, of course, is going to be get, right? Get, even though it's a document, cannot go ahead and be effected in a non-Jewish court. Now, I both say, now, why is that? Take a look at Rashi. Third line down. So we'll say, now listen to this. Halacha l'maisa, because a get, has to be written l'shma. And it has to be written by someone who is subject to the parsha itself. Non-Jews, I will say, don't have a concept of Gittin and Kiddushin. Right? Remember again, how does a non-Jew affect marriage? How does a non-Jew affect marriage? Live with each other. Right? How do they affect divorce? Stop living with each other, right? So I'll say pretty straightforward. There's no concept of Kiddushin. There's no concept of Gittin by Bnei Noach. Because of that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, you can't do Gittin or documents of Kiddushin for that matter in a non-Jewish court. Look at the rest of Rashi. He says, however, aval aladinin nistavu b'nei Noach v'chein shechrui avadim debekol psul daraisa shava shecher legetish le'min la. So I will say, it's interesting enough. So if that's the case, why could I draft my legal documents in a non-Jewish court? I will say because interestingly enough, Bnei Noach do have an obligation to create a judicial system. And they do have an obligation to create a just society. So therefore, again, let's say when it comes to drafting of regular legal documents, that I could actually do, again, it's more complicated, more intricate, but for our purposes today, that I could do in a non-Jewish court. Why? Because they're subject to those same halachas. By Gittin, where they're not subject to those same halachas, I can't draft a get in a non-Jewish court. And also we're going to see pretty much anything that applies to a get isha will also apply to a get shecher. Good. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Good. So therefore we'll say these are the three ways. Ultimately, again, these are the three ways that halacha l'maisa, get isha and get shecher are the same. Number one, they both need Rab Far Nechtav, Far Nechtav. Number two, if they both have an Eid Kusi, the get is still kosher, right? And number three, neither can be done in a Gentile court. Good, beautiful. The Gemara says, Rabbi Meir himself has a fourth similarity. A fourth similarity. What's the fourth? Ha'omer tein get zel ishti, ushtar shecher zel avdi. If a man says, give this get to my wife, and give this document of emancipation to my servant, ratza lachsor b'shnehem yachs d'remer. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. The case over here is like this. The case over here is, if a man gives a get to a shaliach, right? And he tells the shaliach, deliver this to my wife. Deliver this to my wife. And then what happens? He gives it to the hands of the shliach. Shliach is walking away. 15 minutes later, the husband runs after the shliach. He says, no, I retract it. Suppose he has the ability to cancel the get. What's the havamina? The havamina is, I might have thought that once the get reaches the hands of the shaliach, he effectively acquires it on behalf of the woman. Kamash malon, no. Kamash on the get is not effective until when? Until it actually reaches her hands. Rashi says, Tekasavar yachzar, tekasavar Rabbi Meir, hefsid v'chol pein la'osen shnishtuchu lahen, then chavin la'adam el shalav b'fanav. So what we're going to see is essentially like this. There's a concept of zachin la'adam shalav b'fanav, which means you could do something beneficial for someone even without their knowledge, right? So, which means you could acquire something for someone on their behalf even if they don't know. One might have thought that a get maybe is a schos for her, for the eved. Kamash Rabbi Meir says a get is not a schos. Right? A get is not a benefit. A get is actually something detrimental. Again, we'll get more into this. Salach, because it's something detrimental, therefore what? Therefore what? The shaliach does not acquire it on behalf of the woman. The only time it's effectively acquired is when it actually reaches the hands of the woman herself. And this same halacha applies to a get shechur. Now, why a get shechur, a document of emancipation, is considered to be something detrimental, in Miras Hashem, we will discuss. Good. So the Gemara says as follows. Good. So according to Rabbi Meir, there's a fourth similarity. It says Rabbi Shmuel the Rabbanon minyan lamiute hadrai Meir. So according to the Rabbanon, supposed to remember again. So the Brisa said there are three ways in which Gittin Nashim and Shechrur Avadim are similar. So according to the Rabbanon, I understand why the Brisa says three, because they disagree with Rabbi Meir, right? They disagree in the Shaliach case. So the number, I will say in general, whenever you see a Mishnah or a Brisa espouse a number, what's the role of a number? To limit and exclude. So according to the Rabbanon, what's being limited and excluded? The case of Rabbi Meir, the case of the Shliach, they disagree with that case. El Rabbi Meir, minyan l'mi'utei. According to Rabbi Meir, what is the number coming to exclude? L'mi'utei hadisanya. So what's according to Rabbi Meir is coming to exclude the following case. Listen to this. Eidim she'ein yodim lachtom. But it's fascinating. What happens if you have witnesses who are going to sign on a get, or sign on a shtar, I should say, and they don't know how to sign their names? So what do you do for them? Essentially, you know what you do? You create like a stencil, right? Essentially, again, cut out their names in a piece of paper, put it on top of the document, and let them fill out the openings with ink. When is that so? That's true with Gittin Nashim. Aval Shechruri Avadim v'shar kol hashtaros. But also when it comes to Shechruri Avadim and other documents, Im Yodim Likros v'lachtom chosmin. If they know how to read and how to sign, good. They could sign. Ve'im lav ein chosmin. So therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, the number three is coming to exclude this case. What happens if you have illiterate edim? Can they be used for get isha and get shechur? The answer is for get isha they can be used. For get shechrur, they cannot be used. Rabbi say, why the distinction? So Rashi points out, Begitei Nashim mishum takanas agunos. Rabbi say, we're going to see that when it comes to Gittin, we do whatever we can to get this done. Because you recognize that sometimes the situation is such that right now you have a husband who's willing to give a get, and if you delay for whatever the reason, you run the risk of recalcitrance, right? You run the risk of just him pulling it back, and of course that's terrible and that's horrible. And using a get as a tool for any type of negotiation is morally and halachically reprehensible and unacceptable on any level. But lamaisa, the way the system is set up is a husband could change his mind, and if he changes his mind, she's stuck. So therefore, in order to avoid that in any way, what do? We essentially, you can't write, no problem, we got you covered, right? We take out the stencil, we put it on the piece of paper, but again, obviously I will say, in every other case, we recognize that is not an ideal aid, right? An aid who can't sign his own name, that's not, so by Gittin, so according to Rabbi Meir, the number comes to exclude this case. Good. So Gemara says, by the way, Karye, man dikar shmeir. Both say it's interesting because we started talking about a witness who can't sign. And then the Brisa mentioned the witness who can't read. What does reading have to do with this? Why are you bringing up reading? To which the Gemara says, you're right. We're missing something here, so I have to read it. Eidim she'en yodin likros kor lifneim. I will say, listen to this. By a get isha, you can mamish use a totally illiterate aid. If the aid does not know how to read, so we read the document in front of him, the chosman, and then he could sign. So that's assuming what? I'm talking about a case where he can write, but he can't read. Right, but he can't read. So in that case, again, we read the get to him, and then we have him sign. What if the aide does not know how to sign? Then ultimately, again, we'll go ahead and we'll make a stencil for him and allow him to go ahead and sign. I will say, so again, according to Rabbi Meir, this is why the Mishnah, the Brisa says there are three cases. This is the case that's being excluded. We exclude this case of illiterate aidim. So you could use them by get, for the sake of just getting it done, but you cannot use them ultimately again by other documents. Incredible. Let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, are there no other cases? Are there no other cases of similarity? So the Gemara says, V'ha'ika ha'omer tunu get zeli ishti ushta shecher zaladi. Listen to this case. A man says, give this get, right? Reuben is saying to a shaliach, give this get to my wife Rachel, ushta shecher zaladi, or give this document of emancipation to my eved, umeis, and he dies. Now we'll say he dies before it was delivered. So what's the halacha? Lo yitnu la'achar misa. Ultimately, again, we don't give a get after death, right? There's no such thing as a posthumous get. Both a get isha and a get shikr. So we'll say here's another similarity. However, conversely, I will say tenu mana leploni umeis. If let's say Reuven says give a gift, right? Give $1,000 to Shimon, and then he dies. Yitnu la'achar misa, you can give it after death as well. I was supposed to say, interestingly enough, there's such a thing as a post-death gift. There's no such thing as a post-death get. Right? So in other words, you can't, which I say again makes sense, can't divorce a woman once you're dead, and ultimately you also can't go ahead and emancipate your slave once you're dead. Because the moment a person dies, what happens? The slave becomes the property of the yarshim, right? Of the inheritors. So we'll say, so again, we're just pointing out, the Brisa said there's three similarities between Gittin Rashim and Gittin Avadim. There's more than three, right? Here's another similarity. To which the Gemara says, you're right, ki katani milsa delese b'shtaris. What we mean is something that is unique to get isha and get shecher that doesn't apply to other shtaris. But however, milsa de asya b'shtaris, but something that applies ultimately again to other shtaris as well, lo katani. So in other words, we'll say we were looking ultimately again for something unique. This is not a unique halacha. This would apply to other forms of shtaris as well. Okay, for example, the shalach Rabin Mishneh Rabbi Abo Haviyodin Shishalach Rabbi Lazar Lagola Mishum Rabbeinu. Rabbi Lazar sent to the diaspora, name of Rabbi Yudanasi, Shchiv Meira Sha'amar Kisvu Utinu Mana Laploni. Once again, back to the case of Shchiv Meira. Right, so you have a Shchiv Meira who went ahead and said, literally, go ahead and write and give a mana to Ploni, right? Umeis, and he died. In Kosivinosnin, we don't give the gift, Shema lo gamar lahaknoso ela b'shtar. Because it was in this case, Shchimira said, write and give. Shchimira doesn't need a shtar. Right? Shchimira could just give the word and then it's done. The fact that he said, write a shtar, maybe he dafka wants a shtar, but in shtar la'achar misa, and there's no shtar after that. So the point over here is, we find in other cases that we don't do certain things after death as well. When the Brisa went ahead and listed the similarities between get isha and get shikhr, we dafka were noting similarities that only apply to those two things and don't apply to other things. But the shtar piece applies to other things as well. Therefore, so we also have to stop over here for today. Shkoyach, we're going to continue with get shikhr and get isha and just tomorrow's daf as well. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone, and a good yantiv. A good yantiv.